The morning of June 18th, 2021, started like any other in the quiet village of Duckmanton, Derbyshire. The fields stretched endlessly under the pale light of dawn, the stillness only broken by the occasional rustling of leaves and the rhythmic sounds of hooves striking damp earth. It was the kind of morning that held no warning, no indication that, within the hour, this place would become a crime scene. At 7:45 a.m., Gracie Spinks arrived at the stables where she kept her horse, just as she had done countless times before. It was a place she knew well, a place that had always been safe. But something was different that morning. Someone else was there. Less than 30 minutes later, she was found. The details of what happened in those final moments would send shockwaves through her family, her community, and an entire nation. But the real horror? It hadn't started that morning. It had started long before, with warning signs that had been reported, evidence that had been found, and opportunities to prevent what was about to happen. Because this wasn't a random act of violence, and this wasn't a mystery. The police had been told. More than once. A backpack filled with knives, an axe, and a handwritten note was discovered just weeks before Gracie's murder, mere yards from the very spot where her body would later be found. It was reported. Logged. Dismissed. A name had been mentioned before, a pattern had been ignored, and by the time the system recognized the danger, it was already too late. So, the question isn't just how this happened, it's why no one stopped it. Why was Gracie Spinks left unprotected? How many more warnings would it have taken for someone to listen? If you're drawn to true crime stories that uncover not just the crime, but the failures that allowed it to happen, be sure to subscribe to the Criminal Files and turn on notifications. Your support helps bring stories like this to light. This is the story of Gracie Spinks. Gracie Spinks was born on October 19, 1997, in Chesterfield, England. She was the kind of person people didn't forget. Vivacious, adventurous, and endlessly kind, she had a way of making those around her feel valued. She grew up alongside a younger brother, just 16 months apart, and later, a little sister, born to her mother and stepfather. From an early age, Gracie's life revolved around two things, family and animals. She had an undeniable passion for horses, one that shaped much of her identity. Her beloved horse, Paddy, was more than just a pet. He was a lifelong dream realized. To care for him, she took on multiple jobs, working tirelessly to afford stable fees, food, and the endless expenses that came with horse ownership. But Gracie was more than just a horse lover. She was an accomplished equestrian, a skilled swimmer, and a trained lifeguard. She had ambitions, plans, and a future filled with possibilities. She was strong, independent, and unafraid to speak her mind, until one person stepped into her life. A person who saw her strength as a challenge. A person who mistook her kindness for something else entirely. In April 2020, Gracie took a job at Xbyte, an internet retail company based in Chesterfield. It was meant to be temporary, just a stepping stone toward something bigger. But it was there, among the stacks of video games, gadgets, and office chatter, that she first met Michael Sellers. At first, he was just another coworker, a quiet, unassuming man, 12 years her senior. Colleagues described him as introverted, socially awkward, and intensely fixated on people who gave him attention. For Michael, it didn't take much to develop an attachment. And Gracie, kind, open, friendly, had unknowingly become his next fixation. At first, their interactions were normal. A few messages exchanged, casual conversations at work, a polite acquaintance. Then, something changed. By December 2020, Michael made it clear that he wanted something more. He suggested dates, made advances, pushed the boundaries of their conversations. But Gracie, always honest, never led him on. She made her feelings clear. She wasn't interested. She had no attraction to him, no desire for a relationship. For most people, rejection is just that, a sign to move on. But for Michael Sellers, rejection wasn't an answer, and so he didn't move on. He clung on. And as the days passed, that harmless interest began to evolve into something else, something darker, something Gracie didn't see coming. At first it was just messages, then it was unwanted gifts, then he started turning up places he shouldn't be. And then, one morning in January 2021, Gracie arrived at the stables and saw Michael waiting for her. Sitting there, silent, watching. For the first time, she felt real fear. What does a person do when they realize someone is watching them? When someone refuses to let them go? For Gracie, the answer was clear. She reported him. She told the managers at Expite that Michael's behavior was making her uncomfortable, that he was following her, harassing her, refusing to take no for an answer. The workplace took action. Michael was suspended, then later fired. It should have ended there, but it didn't. Because Michael wasn't just watching, he was planning. And Gracie? She still didn't know just how much danger she was really in. Michael Sellers was not the kind of man people feared. He was 35, quiet, awkward, the kind of person most overlooked. He had worked at Expite, the online retail company, for years, never causing trouble, never standing out. He lived at home with his parents, kept to himself, and didn't have much of a social life. But what people didn't know was that Michael had a pattern, a dangerous one. He had a habit of latching onto people, particularly women who showed him kindness. And then in April 2020, he met Gracie Spinks, a 23-year-old woman full of life, ambition, and independence. Someone who had her whole future ahead of her. Someone who, for Michael, represented everything he didn't have. At first, she was just a coworker. But in his mind, she became something more. Michael was notoriously bad at reading social cues. He wasn't just introverted, he was obsessive. He fixated on people who paid attention to him, convinced that any friendliness was a sign of deeper meaning. He created relationships in his head that didn't exist in reality. And that's exactly what happened with Gracie. It started as casual conversation at work. He mistook her politeness for interest. Then he started sending messages. At first, friendly, then more personal, then persistent. By December 2020, it was clear. He wanted more. Gracie wasn't cruel. She wasn't dismissive. She simply told him the truth. She wasn't interested. But Michael didn't accept that. Rejection, to him, wasn't a no. It was a challenge. Michael wasn't just heartbroken. He was insulted. He began convincing himself that Gracie had misled him, that she had led him on, that she had taken something from him that he had never actually been given. His behavior shifted. He began watching her more closely at work. He found excuses to be near her. His attention became unsettling. And then in January 2021, he crossed the first major line. One morning as Gracie arrived at her stables, he was there, sitting, watching, waiting. There was no reason for him to be there. None. Gracie saw him, and she felt it immediately. That feeling in the pit of your stomach when something isn't right. What does a person do when they realize they're being watched? She didn't stop. She didn't confront him. She drove straight to work, shaken. And that's when she reported him. This should have been the end of it. Instead, it was only the beginning. Michael was fired from Expite shortly after Gracie reported him. His behavior at work had become a growing concern, not just for Gracie, but for others. For a brief moment, it seemed like the nightmare was over. But what happens when you take everything away from a man who believes the world already owes him something? Michael may have lost his job, but he still had access to information. He asked former coworkers to watch Gracie for him, to tell him what she was doing, who she was with. And when that wasn't enough, he took matters into his own hands. Gracie thought she had cut him out of her life. She had no idea that Michael Sellers was already planning his way back in. Michael Sellers had been rejected. For most, rejection is painful. It stings. It forces a person to reflect, to accept, to move on. But Michael wasn't like most people. For him, rejection wasn't the end. It was the start of something far more dangerous. It wasn't just about losing Gracie. It was about losing control. And for a man like Michael Sellers, control was everything. At first, his fixation operated in the shadows. A text message here, a casual appearance there. Nothing that could be labeled as a crime, but just enough to be unsettling. Then, the messages became more frequent. They started as apologies, regrets, pleas, just talk to me. Then, they turned into demands, accusations. Why are you ignoring me? When that didn't work, they became threats. Gracie did what any rational person would do. She blocked him, blocked his number, blocked him on social media, cut off every line of contact. But Michael found ways around it. What does a person do when blocking someone isn't enough? When the messages stop, but the fear doesn't? Gracie had started to feel something she had never felt before. She wasn't safe. Michael's messages were only the beginning. He turned up at her home, showing up uninvited, unannounced. He would bring things she had forgotten at work, excuses to see her. He would wait outside as if she would suddenly change her mind. Gracie knew what was happening. She wasn't being paranoid. She wasn't overreacting. She was being stalked. And then she learned something that made her blood run cold. Michael had been watching her at work. Not just in passing, not just when they happened to be in the same room. He had been using the company's CCTV cameras to track her movements. He was spying on her. This wasn't infatuation anymore. This wasn't about getting her back. This was about control. It was a cold morning when Gracie pulled into the stable yard. It was early. The kind of early where the world still felt half asleep. The sun had barely risen, the air was crisp, and the only sound was the occasional whinny of a horse in the distance. And then she saw him, Michael Sellers, sitting there, in his car, waiting for her. What does a person do in that moment, when they realize their worst fear is real? She didn't stop. She didn't look at him. She kept driving, straight past him, straight to work. And when she got there, she made the call. The 999 call should have been enough. The red flags were there. Unwanted messages, unwanted visits, surveillance at work, waiting for her at a secluded location. What more did they need? She wasn't asking for much. She didn't want him arrested. She didn't want a scene. She just wanted it on record. I don't want him to be arrested or anything, but I just want something to be on file in case this gets worse. The officer listened, took notes, logged the call, and then they dismissed it. He's harmless, they told her. He hasn't made any threats. He hasn't hurt you. They graded Michael as low risk. They told her they couldn't do much unless he actually did something. This was the moment, the last best chance to stop what was coming. A risk assessment could have been done, a protective order could have been issued, Michael could have been watched, monitored, questioned, but none of that happened. And as Gracie left the police station that day, she had no idea that her fate had already been sealed. Because Michael wasn't done, and the worst was yet to come. It was May 6, 2021, when a local woman set out for a walk near Blue Lodge Farm, the countryside that stretched beyond Gracie Spinks' horse stable. She had taken this route many times before, a peaceful escape from the noise of daily life. But that morning, something caught her eye. At first glance, it was easy to miss. A dark, slumped shape tucked into the overgrown grass, just off the main path. A backpack, sitting there as if someone had placed it down and never come back for it. She hesitated. It looked deliberately hidden, not simply lost. Something about it felt wrong. Curiosity is a strange thing. It urges people to look closer, to seek answers, even when instincts whisper that they shouldn't. She unzipped the bag, and what she found should have changed everything. Inside the bag, there was no wallet, no clothes, no personal items, just weapons, a hammer, an axe, several knives, plastic bags, and at the bottom, a note. 4 words, handwritten in unsettling simplicity. Don't lie. The moment she saw it, she knew. This wasn't a forgotten camping bag. This wasn't a survivalist's gear. This was something else. Something that didn't belong here, in the middle of a quiet countryside path, yards away from where a woman came every morning, alone. Something that carried a purpose that she didn't want to imagine. What would you do if you found a backpack like this? Would you assume the worst? Or would you hesitate, convince yourself that you were just reading too much into it? She didn't hesitate. She picked up the bag, zipped it shut, and took it straight to the police. She reported everything. And then, she waited. She expected concern, she expected urgency, she expected the police to do something. Instead, they barely looked at it. The officers took the bag, logged it, and brushed it off. They never examined the note. They never dusted the knives for prints. They never investigated how it got there. Instead, they made an assumption, one that would cost a woman her life. They concluded that it likely belonged to a camper, a survivalist, a bushcraft enthusiast. That's all. Nothing sinister. Nothing to be concerned about. And with that, the backpack, this clear, undeniable warning sign, was dismissed. No report was made. No alerts were raised. No one thought to cross-check it with any recent police reports. And so it sat, unopened, unexamined, a crucial red flag ignored. The police had one job, to ask a simple question. Who would leave a bag like this, filled with weapons, near an area where people frequent? Had they checked, they would have found that just 4 months earlier, a woman named Gracie Spinks had made a stalking report. They would have learned that she was being followed, that she had seen a man sitting outside her stables, waiting, that she had felt unsafe enough to report him. And if they had gone one step further, if they had treated this backpack like the serious threat it was, they might have found something else. A receipt, tucked away at the bottom of the bag, forgotten among the knives and the axe. A receipt from Marks & Spencer's, a purchase made just days before. A transaction linked to a credit card, a card that belonged to Michael Sellers' father. It was right there. The link between Michael and the bag. And yet, no one checked. This wasn't just police negligence. This was the single greatest opportunity to stop what was coming. A woman had reported a stalker. A bag of weapons had been found. A handwritten note, vague but personal, had been discovered. Don't lie. A phrase that screamed of intended violence. And yet, when the moment came, when the police could have put the pieces together, they looked the other way. What would have happened if they had taken one extra step? If they had asked one more question? If they had connected the dots before it was too late? Instead, they let it sit. A time bomb, ticking away, unnoticed, unimportant. Until 6 weeks later when Gracie Spinks was found bleeding out in that very same field. What if? What if the officer handling the bag had taken a second look? What if they had checked for fingerprints? What if they had connected it to the stalking case? Would Michael Sellers have been arrested? Would Gracie have been warned? Would she still be alive? We'll never know. Because in May 2021, the evidence was handed to the police, and they did nothing. Had they checked, they would have found a direct link to Michael Sellers, and Gracie Spinks might still be alive. The morning of June 18, 2021, was calm, ordinary, indistinguishable from any other summer morning in Derbyshire. The soft light of dawn crept over the countryside, the stables resting in a quiet stillness. To anyone passing through, there was no sign of danger. But danger doesn't always announce itself. Somewhere in Duckmanton, a young woman woke up, completely unaware that this would be the last time she ever opened her eyes. Somewhere else, a man had already been awake for hours, fully aware that this was the day he had been waiting for. 2 people. One would never return home. The other would never leave the field where he sat, thinking about what he had done. One of them had no idea what was coming. The other had been planning for months. Michael Sellers had barely slept. He had spent the night before pacing, thinking, preparing. There were no second thoughts, no hesitation. At 6:15 a.m., he moved with a quiet, eerie certainty, loading his car, carefully placing the things he needed into the trunk. A change of clothes, a knife, a note. CCTV footage later captured him leaving his home, driving away without a word. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't leave an explanation. Because in his mind there was nothing to explain. Everything had already been decided. Miles away, Gracie Spinks was waking up, completely unaware that she was about to step into a nightmare. She had plans that day. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. She got dressed, grabbed her things, and left her house for what she believed would be just another morning at the stables. Did she glance at her phone? Did she hesitate before stepping outside, feeling something was off? Or was this just like any other morning, a routine she had done 1,000 times before? At 7:11 a.m., Gracie's car pulled out of the driveway. At that exact moment, Michael Sellers was already waiting for her. Gracie's car rolled into the stable yard. The world was silent. No one else had arrived yet. She stepped out, completely unaware that she wasn't alone. Did she feel the presence before she saw him? Did she sense something was off? Or did she turn her head at the last second only to see him standing there, waiting? Michael Sellers had positioned himself perfectly. He had waited for this, planned for this. For months, he had imagined this moment, and now it was real, a sick fantasy brought to life. Did he speak first? Did he say her name? Did he demand one last conversation? Or did he launch forward without a word, without hesitation? The knife in his hand, a blade that had been hidden moments before, was now plunging into her with unstoppable force. One strike, then another, then another. By the time it was over, Gracie had been stabbed 10 times, not once. Not in the heat of the moment, 10 times. Over and over again, as if he needed to make sure, as if the attack wasn't just about taking her life, it was about punishing her. For rejecting him, for moving on, for living a life without him in it. What was going through his mind? Was he calm? Did he feel anything at all? Or was this the moment he had been waiting for all along? The moment where he finally had complete control. Gracie's body was found minutes later. A passerby saw something in the field that shouldn't have been there. Something out of place. Something horribly, unmistakably wrong. A lifeless form lying in the dirt. The world kept moving, completely unaware that a young woman's life had just been stolen. The authorities were called. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but there was nothing they could do. Gracie Spinks, 23 years old, full of life, full of dreams, was gone. But Michael Sellers was nowhere to be found. For hours, the police had no idea where he was, until they did. Michael didn't run. He didn't hide. Instead, he walked away, through the fields, alone, blood still on his hands, the weight of his actions finally settling in. For 3 hours, he sat there. Was he thinking? Was he regretting? Or was this always the plan? By the time authorities finally tracked him down, it was already over. Michael Sellers, the man who had tormented Gracie for over a year, the man who had taken her life, was dead. He had ended it on his own terms. No punishment, no justice, just a final act of selfish control. Because in the end, that's what this was always about. Gracie never had a choice. She didn't get to escape. She didn't get to walk away. But Michael did. The news spread fast. The young woman, ignored, unprotected, unheard, was gone. A murderer whose name had been reported months before had carried out exactly what Gracie feared. The system had failed her. And now, the question remains, how many warnings does it take before someone listens? How many women need to be ignored before stalking is taken seriously? How many more lives need to be lost before real change happens? Because this wasn't a random attack. It was planned, and Gracie Spinks paid the price. The murder of Gracie Spinks wasn't just a tragedy. It was a catastrophic failure, a series of missed opportunities, ignored warnings, and reckless inaction that allowed a predator to walk free. A murder that should have never happened. A crime that was preventable. And yet, when investigators began piecing together what had led to June 18, 2021, they uncovered something even more disturbing. Gracie Spinks wasn't just a single victim. Michael Sellers had been a problem long before Gracie entered his life. And time again, he had been reported. Michael Sellers was not an unknown threat. In the months following Gracie's murder, 8 other women came forward. 8 different women, all of whom had stories that sounded eerily familiar. Unwanted messages, unannounced visits, obsession that escalated when rejected. How many times does a man have to be reported before someone takes it seriously? One of these women, a former Expite employee, reported feeling unsafe working around him. She claimed that his presence was unsettling, that she had expressed concerns to management. Another woman said that Michael had bombarded her with messages, similar to the way he had pursued Gracie. And yet, nothing was done. Michael Sellers was allowed to continue working at Expite for months, even after he had been reported internally. It was only when Gracie herself spoke up that action was taken. But even then, being fired wasn't enough to stop him, because the obsession didn't die, and Michael didn't forget. Then there was the backpack. A chilling, undeniable warning sign discovered just 6 weeks before Gracie's murder. A bag of weapons found yards from where she would later be killed. Inside, knives, a hammer, an axe. Plastic bags, a handwritten note that read, "Don't lie." It had been handed to police, and they had done nothing. They dismissed it, shrugged it off as bushcraft tools. But what they failed to do, what could have changed everything, was check for fingerprints. Because if they had, they would have found a receipt. A small, seemingly insignificant slip of paper. But that receipt held the key to everything. It was from Marks and Spencer's. A recent transaction, tied to a credit card that belonged to Michael Sellers' father. The link was right there, a direct connection between Michael and the bag. And yet, no one made it. The officers who took the bag into evidence never ran forensic tests, never traced the purchase, never questioned why a bag of weapons and a threatening note had been left near the stables of a woman who had reported being stalked. Instead, it sat in storage, forgotten. And 6 weeks later, Gracie Spinks was dead. There are procedures for cases like this. Steps that law enforcement should take to assess risk, predict escalation, and prevent harm. But for some reason, the Derbyshire police failed to follow any of them. Michael Sellers was classified as low risk, despite multiple stalking behaviors. A police report from Gracie A found bag of weapons. How does that happen? How does a man with a documented history of harassment, an obsession with a specific woman, and a discovered bag of weapons, how does that man get ignored? How does the system fail so completely that every single warning sign is overlooked? Was it laziness, negligence, or is the system simply broken? Because here's the thing about risk assessments. They exist for a reason. They are meant to identify threats before it's too late. They are meant to protect people like Gracie. And in this case, they were never done. No one asked, how dangerous is this man? How far might he go? What will he do if no one stops him? No one flagged him. No one intervened. And so, Michael Sellers was free to keep watching, free to keep planning, free to decide when it would all come to an end. After the murder, the Derbyshire Police Department came under intense scrutiny, rightfully so, because the truth was undeniable. Gracie did everything she was supposed to do. She reported him. She asked for help. She told people she was scared. And yet it still happened. A woman was murdered in broad daylight in the exact place where she had said she felt unsafe, by a man who had been reported, identified, known. How does that happen? How does an entire system fail a person so completely that their murder feels inevitable? Because this wasn't just a failure of law enforcement, it was a failure of accountability, a failure of responsibility, and most of all, a failure to listen. Every warning sign was there, and every single one was ignored. Because the failures didn't stop with Gracie. They didn't stop with Michael Sellers. They didn't stop with this one case. Because Gracie Spinks wasn't the first woman to be ignored, and she wouldn't be the last. What if the system had worked? What if the police had done their job? What if, just once, someone had taken her seriously? Would she still be here? Would Michael Sellers have been stopped? Or was she always doomed to become another statistic, another victim, another name added to the list of people failed by the very system that was meant to protect them? Because Gracie Spinks is gone. But the question remains, how many more will follow? The days following June 18, 2021 were filled with grief, confusion, and disbelief. A young woman was dead. A dangerous man had slipped through the cracks, and an entire community was left wondering, how did this happen? Because Gracie Spinks should have been protected. She did everything she was supposed to do. She reported him, she told people she felt unsafe, she followed the rules, and yet she was still murdered. The system that was meant to protect her had failed at every level, and now it was too late to fix it. Too late to save her. The day of Gracie's funeral was a day no parent should ever have to endure. Hundreds of mourners gathered to say goodbye. Family, friends, members of the community who had never met her but who had felt the weight of her story. The grief was overwhelming. People cried, held hands, whispered words of disbelief. Because this wasn't just a tragic death, it was a preventable one. At the front of the room, her parents sat in silence, their world shattered. They had raised a daughter who was strong, independent, full of life, and now they were burying her. How do you say goodbye to someone who should still be here? When Richard Spinks, Gracie's father, spoke, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. His voice was steady, but his pain was unmistakable. Gracie was the light of our lives. She had so much ahead of her. And the police let her down. The weight of those words hung in the air. Because he was right. Gracie had been let down. Not just by one officer. Not just by one mistake, but by an entire system that refused to take stalking seriously. Gracie's death sent shockwaves across the UK and beyond. People weren't just angry. They were furious. Because this wasn't an isolated case. This was a pattern. A pattern of women warning the police about violent men and being ignored. A pattern of victims being told there's nothing we can do until it was too late. A pattern of murders that could have been prevented. People took to social media, news outlets, community forums, demanding answers. Why wasn't Michael Sellers stopped? Why wasn't the backpack investigated? Why was Gracie's report dismissed? Why are women still not being believed? And most importantly, how many more lives will be lost before something changes? The pressure mounted. The police were forced to respond. They issued statements, cold, impersonal, filled with words that meant nothing. They expressed deep regret. They promised to review policies. But Gracie's family, her friends, the public, none of them were satisfied. Because words wouldn't bring her back. Words wouldn't undo what had already been done. People weren't asking for apologies. They were asking for action. For real change. For laws that would protect women from being hunted, harassed, and murdered by men who refused to take no for an answer. For a system that listens. A system that believes women before it's too late. Too often, stories like Gracie's fade from the headlines. The outrage burns bright, and then it dies. Until the next woman is killed. Until the next preventable tragedy unfolds. But Gracie Spinks is more than just a statistic. Her name should be remembered. Her story should be told. Because she isn't just another victim. She is a reminder. A reminder that one report ignored is one life at risk. A reminder that stalking is not just obsession, it is a warning. And most of all, a reminder that this cannot keep happening. Because Gracie Spinks is gone. But her story isn't over. It's a call to action. A call for change. And the question remains, will we listen this time? Gracie Spinks was more than just a headline. She was more than a statistic. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She was someone who laughed loudly, loved fiercely, and fought for what she believed in. She was a dreamer, a fighter, a woman with her whole life ahead of her. She was never meant to be a victim. She was meant to fall in love, travel the world, ride her horse for years to come. She was meant to grow old, to tell stories, to live. But instead she was taken. And now she will never ride again. Never see another sunrise. Never get to experience all the things she should have. Because someone decided that if he couldn't have her, no one could. And a system that should have protected her failed. Gracie did everything right. She reported her stalker. She asked for help. She warned the police. And still, she was ignored. Still, she was failed. How many more women have to die before stalking is taken seriously? How many more victims have to scream into the void before someone listens? How many more warnings will be ignored before something changes? Because Gracie Spinks is gone. But there are others. Right now there are women reading this, watching this, living in fear. They hear footsteps behind them on their way home. They check over their shoulders in parking lots. They double lock their doors. They block numbers. They call the police. And they are told the same thing Gracie was told. He's harmless. There's nothing we can do. Until he does something. Until it's too late. Gracie should still be here. She should be riding her horse through the fields of Derbyshire, smiling in the sun. Instead, her story is now a warning to others. Because if the system doesn't change, if stalking continues to be brushed aside, there will be another Gracie. Another name. Another woman whose warnings were ignored. Another life lost. And so we ask again, how many more? How many more lives will be stolen before the world finally listens? Because Gracie Spinks is gone. But this can't keep happening. If you believe this story needs to be heard, don't let Gracie's name fade away. Hit the like button to spread awareness. Subscribe to the Criminal Files for more in-depth true crime stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss a case that deserves justice. Your voice matters. Your awareness matters. Together, we can help make sure that no more lives are lost to a system that refuses to listen. Because Gracie Spinks deserved better. And so do the women who are still waiting to be heard.